Our programs offer many languages. Please visit suprememastertv.com/schedule.
Does consciousness exist beyond the body and brain? Is a near-death experience evidence of this fact?
The near-death experience is so important, in my opinion, because it looks at memories and logical thinking that seems to be occurring at a time when the body is barely functional or not functional at all. So a near-death experience is an instance where a person has some kind of physiological trauma, something where the brain isn't functioning in a way where we would predict a clear consciousness. And yet, in many cases, people report a very clear consciousness, clearer than usual thinking, more logical than usual thinking during this time of impaired brain functioning.
The Curious Relationship Between the Brain and Consciousness, Part 2 of 3. Continue watching to find out more. Greetings, loving viewers. It is our honor to have Ms. Matilda Zita present Part 2 of our 3-part series, The Curious Relationship Between the Brain and Consciousness. Ms. Zita is a professional psychological assistant. Since 2000, she has been working in the medical social sector, providing support for people who are limited in their daily activities. She is qualified to provide assistance to her clients in a wide range of situations, including during emergencies and while traveling. Through additional professional experience gained by attending workshops and helping with administrative work, Ms. Zita has mastered the skills required to help those in need. In her free time, Ms. Zita enjoys cooking, gardening, and drawing.
Bonjour téléspectateurs judicieux, je suis Mathilde Zida de la bienveillante Atapamé au Togo. Le peuple vertueux de mon pays vous souhaite de toujours avoir le cœur en paix. Dans le programme d'aujourd'hui, nous continuerons notre interview avec M. Marc Goubert, l'auteur de La fin de la réflexion à l'envers et l'animateur du nouveau podcast Où est mon esprit? Dans son étude, M. Goubert a trouvé énormément de preuves scientifiques et d'anecdotes qui suggèrent que la conscience existe au-delà du cerveau. L'argument le plus convaincant vient peut-être des expériences de mort imminente.
The near-death experience is so important, in my opinion, because it looks at memories and logical thinking that seems to be occurring at a time when the body is barely functional or not functional at all. So a near-death experience is an instance where a person has some kind of physiological trauma. So cardiac arrest is a good example, but it could be other types of trauma. It could be a person under general anesthesia, something where the brain isn't functioning in a way where we would predict a clear consciousness. And yet, in many cases, people report a very clear consciousness, clearer than usual thinking, more logical than usual thinking during this time of impaired brain functioning. Some people talk about hovering over the body, actually leaving their body in an out-of-body experience. They sometimes see things in the room from the vantage point of being above their body that is verified as being accurate upon returning to the body, which is very compelling. It's indicating that the clear consciousness is occurring at the time they were physiologically impaired. So to give a quote from Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, this is from one of my interviews from my podcast, he says, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. So what's suggested here in the near-death experience, based on many cases over the ages, and by the way, this is referred to in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Plato talked about this. So this is a phenomenon that's been reported for ages, but only in the last few decades has it picked up more mainstream steam because of our resuscitation technology. So the number of cases is increasing and now scientists can study it systematically. So what it's suggesting is that consciousness can exist independently of a functioning body. And that's exactly what this theory of consciousness that we spoke about at the beginning would predict, that consciousness isn't tied to the brain. And what's even more interesting to me is the fact that thinking and experiencing seems to be enriched during this time of little or no brain functioning. So it matches with the idea that consciousness is actually limited or blocked by the brain. And when you get the brain out of the way, it exposes us to this much broader reality that's always been there. It's just that the brain actually has filtered it out. I think some of the most important studies on near-death experiences are known as prospective cardiac arrest studies. Medical doctors interviewed people who survived cardiac arrest soon after they were resuscitated. And they asked them, did you have any experiences? Do you have any memories? And in these studies, about 80% of people say they don't remember anything, but close to 20% talk about vivid memories that are characteristic of this typical near-death experience. Hovering over their bodies, experiencing unconditional love. Sometimes they experience beings. They'll call them mystical or religious beings, beings of light. Sometimes deceased relatives appear, and maybe if the person died looking a certain way, the deceased relative will appear as a younger age. So there are encounters with beings. There's also something known as a life review, where people re-experience their life in a flash, and they relive it not only from their own perspective, but from the perspective of each person they affected.
Nous prendrons quelques instants pour penser aux êtres que nous avons croisés et à la façon dont nos paroles et actions les ont peut-être marqués. Nous revenons dans quelques instants. Alors, restez sur Supreme Master Television.
Welcome back to the curious relationship between the brain and consciousness, part 2 of 3. Ms. Matilda Zita will now continue to present our interview with Mr. Mark Gober.
Dans son podcast en anglais, Où est mon esprit, M. Gober a interviewé de nombreuses personnes sur leurs expériences de mort imminente.
One of my favorite interviews from my podcast, Where is My Mind, is with a man named Daniel Brinkley, who had 4 near-death experiences, and each time he had a life review. So in his case, it was particularly extreme because he fought in Vietnam, and he told me that he was vicious in combat. So during his life review, he had to relive the deaths of the people that he killed from their eyes. And not only that, he felt the indirect effect of his actions. He felt the pain of the child who no longer had a father because he had killed the father in combat. So what he experienced in the life review, just like many people who have had the experience, is that life, the purpose of our existence, at least in part, seems to be about this interconnectedness, about how we treat one another. And that's why in the near-death experience state, our consciousness is maybe released in a way so that we can view things from multiple lenses because we're interconnected as part of the same consciousness. And this is happening during a time of severe bodily impairment, brain impairment, that is telling us potentially something about the nature of reality.
Monsieur Gober explique que si nous comprenons vraiment que notre identité existe au-delà de notre corps, cela changera notre façon de concevoir nos vies et pourrait même nous rendre plus heureux.
I think in part we can become happier if we really internalize the idea that our identity is not limited to our body. I think there is kind of a lingering fear of death that many people have, and I probably had it prior to my research, because I thought that the death of the body meant the end of consciousness, the end of memories, the end of life. And now I think there's just so much evidence that that's not true, that the consciousness exists beyond the body. It might allow us to lighten up a little bit and just feel somewhat less pressure in the body, and that can lead to greater happiness. But on the other hand, the notion that consciousness exists beyond the body brings a sense of responsibility and accountability that wasn't there before. So in the life review, for the example of Daniel Brinkley, after he relived his life 4 times, he saw the pain that he inflicted and he saw the joy that he gave to people. So when he came back from his near-death experience, his life changed dramatically. He was much less materialistic. He became a hospice volunteer, and he understands the accountability that we all have that our actions matter beyond what happens in this body. So I think it can make us happier, these concepts, because we realize that we're more than just the body, but at the same time, there is a responsibility that comes along with it.
Monsieur Gobert espère que son livre aidera les gens à devenir davantage conscients que toute l'humanité est connectée. Il est persuadé qu'une telle compréhension aura un effet profond sur notre monde.
We're interconnected as part of the same stream of water, meaning even though we're having individual experiences, it seems like we're separate. We're not actually separate at the most fundamental level. So when I look at the world's problems today, geopolitical problems, violence, interpersonal problems, many, if not all of those problems seem to stem from the belief that we are finite beings who are fundamentally separate from one another. And that stems from the belief that the brain creates consciousness. So if the brain doesn't create consciousness, and if we are beyond our bodies, and if we are interconnected, then how might we treat one another? And that is, I think, the core solution, possibly, to many, if not all, of the world's problems. It's like the symptoms are violence, geopolitical problems, interpersonal problems, but the disease is the misunderstanding of reality, the belief that consciousness comes from the brain, and the belief that we are finite and separate beings.
Nous remercions M. Marc Gobert d'avoir partagé ses réflexions sur l'interconnexion entre tous les êtres humains. Soyez bénis pour votre noble travail.
For more information about Mr. Marc Gobert, please visit marcgobert.com.
Téléspectateurs élevés, merci pour votre compagnie aujourd'hui. Rendez-vous le lundi 4 novembre pour le dernier épisode de cette série. Dans un instant, retrouvez le journal du Maître suprême Chin Hai. Les maîtres vivants peuvent libérer toutes les âmes rachetables. Première partie de 4 épisodes dans Entre maîtres et disciples, juste après les nouvelles déceptions. Avec l'immense grâce du divin, puissiez-vous cultiver chaque jour votre sagesse et votre compassion.
Elevated viewers, thank you for your company today. Please join us again on Monday, November 4th for the concluding episode in this series. Coming up next is Supreme Master Chin Hai's Diary. The Living Masters Can Liberate All Redeemable Souls. Part 1 of 4 on Between Master and Disciples. Right after noteworthy news. Through the immense grace of the divine, may you grow each day in wisdom and compassion.
Our programs offer many languages. Please visit suprememastertv.com/schedule and suprememastertv.com/ss.
Nos programmes offrent plusieurs langues. Veuillez visiter suprememastertv.com/schedule et suprememastertv.com/ss.
Nuestros programas ofrecen varios idiomas. Visiten suprememastertv.com/schedule, suprememastertv.com/ss.
Наши программы предлагают много языков. Пожалуйста, посмотрите suprememastertv.com/schedule и suprememastertv.com/ss.